Chris drove along the winding mountain road in his beat-up pickup. He'd been looking forward to this trip for months. He worked in Los Angeles as a print ad designer for an advertising agency and hated it. When he took the job, the guy who hired him had let him work from home, on his own projects, by himself, with little to no oversight. The company had even given him a portable hotspot so he could work while camping, which he loved. Just about 6 months after being hired, the company was bought out, and he found himself sitting in a cube farm with no view of the outside, having to interact with a team of stupid, lazy, boring coworkers, and at the beck and call of 3 overly controlling moron bosses. That was 2 years ago, and for Chris, it could not have been worse.
Finally alone,
he thought. That was all he wanted, to be in the middle of nowhere in the Sierra Nevadas. He'd found this camping site on Google Earth and packed 2 weeks prior. Chris felt a bit silly about it, but he got a shiver of excitement every time he passed the overloaded hiking pack on the couch by the door. A whole week in the mountains. It was going to be heaven. Now, less than an hour from his destination, he could barely stop squirming in his seat. When he pulled into the dirt lot that served as parking for the campground, he was almost heartbroken by the sight of 3 cars already there.
No,
he said aloud. It was in the middle of the week in late fall, a time of year he chose for the cold, which he thought would keep everyone away.
There shouldn't be anyone here,
he shouted, and slammed his palms against the steering wheel.
Okay, Chris,
he said to himself.
It's a big campground. You may not even see them. No need to let this ruin your trip.
He parked as far from the other cars in the lot as he could and got out. Pulling his pack off the passenger side of the bench seat, he took a long, deep breath and let it out before strapping the 40-pound pack that contained his tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, and enough food and water for a week. He then grabbed his fishing pole and small tackle box from the truck bed and started the long hike to the small lake that was going to be his home for the next week. This was a test for him. He had always fantasized about going off-grid, living out in the middle of the forest and living off the land. If he could make it on his own for this week, it would prove, at least to himself, that he could do it for real. The lake was a 2-hour hike over some rough terrain. He held out hope that the owners of the cars that he'd seen in the lot didn't make it out that far. As he hiked, he cocked his head at every sound that might be human in origin, a little hope lost each time the sound proved to be a bird or raccoon, still holding on to a deep desire to see a full camp somewhere on the path, far from its destination. No such luck. He heard them before he topped the hill that bordered the lake, and then he saw them. 5 young idiots. He was sure they were idiots.
Damn it,
he said quietly as one of the 20-somethings partying around the large campfire noticed him. It was a big, blonde, obviously drunk bear of a man.
Woo! Come on down! The fire is fine!
The oaf shouted. Chris made up his mind. He would just ignore them and hike around to the other side of the lake. The big idiot had other plans. Chris, having not so much as waved, now seemed to be the target of an unwanted hospitality campaign, and the big one grabbed a bottle off the camp table and started up the path towards him. Chris sighed and prepared for the drunken dumbassery that he was about to suffer through, and approached the man.
Hey, buddy, you want some?
Chris held up his hand to stop him.
I don't drink,
he said, not trying to hide his contempt.
Well, how about...
No.
Chris walked past him.
Hey, man, don't be rude. I was trying to be friendly.
Chris kept walking, but within seconds he heard footsteps behind him and felt a meaty hand on his shoulder. He stopped and turned to face the annoying giant.
Look, whoever you are.
Chris started.
Paul,
said Paul, pointing at himself.
Look, Paul, I deal with people all day long at work. I came out here to get away from them. I'm sorry, but by them, I mean you.
Chris turned back down the path and continued to the right, past the young campers without even a glance in their direction. He happily set out for the other side of the lake, but was almost overwhelmed by the feeling that he was being followed. He looked over his shoulder several times, expecting to see one of them coming up behind him. But there was nothing there.
Maybe it's because I know they're there.
Even with the annoyance at his unwelcome neighbors, he was determined to make this a good trip. He was very pleased to realize that although he could see their fire from the spot he picked, he couldn't hear them. The wind coming down the mountain seemed to keep the sound from reaching him across the lake. The sun was just setting by the time Chris had set up his one-man tent in a clearing about 30 feet from the lakeshore. He spent 15 minutes or so gathering tinder, kindling, and some dead branches from the surrounding area. He took out his pocket knife and flint kit and started his fire on a rocky point on the beach. With the small fire going strong, Chris dug into his pack and pulled out his sketch pad and pencil set. He sat with his back to the lake and looked at how the fire lit up the tree line, admiring the subtle shift in the foliage as the flames and the moonlight played with the shadows. He looked to where he knew his tent was. though he couldn't see it through the trees, and started to sketch. He captured every leaf, every twig, every knot, every detail exactly as it was. Line by line, it came to life on the paper. Each detail seemed to pop off the page perfectly. He was almost in a trance of absolute focus when suddenly from behind him came a loud splash. Chris jumped, sending his pencil sliding hard across the page, marring his masterpiece. He turned to see Paul, the big blonde oaf standing not 20 feet to the right of him, holding a large stone. Almost hidden in his shadow was a small, equally blonde girl, maybe about 18 years old. She moved around him and walked towards Chris.
Sorry about my brother.
She said, thumbing over her shoulder as Paul threw the other rock into the lake, making an equally loud splash as the one before it.
We were making dinner and I wanted to invite you, since you're all alone out here.
No, thanks. I brought my own.
Chris patted the pack he was sitting on. She walked a bit closer to Chris and the fire, leaning in and speaking quietly.
Please join us. My brother is hammered, his friend won't leave me alone, and my best friend and my ex-boyfriend are hooking up in the tent that we are all supposed to share.
Chris shrugged.
Like I told your brother earlier, I came out here to get away from people.
He started trying to erase the dark line across the middle of the page.
I'm sorry. You seem really nice, and your friends all sound charming. But I'd much rather be here alone.
He stopped erasing and looked up at her. She had crouched next to him and was looking down at the page.
Wow,
She said, ignoring his previous statements.
you're really good.
Thanks, I guess.
Chris said, no longer trying to be pleasant.
He's not coming, Alex. Let's go.
Okay then.
She said, standing back up.
Well, we'll be right across the lake eating tri-tip if you change your mind.
She turned on heel and headed back towards Paul, who was already stumbling away.
And don't let the monster you drew get you.
Huh?
Chris said, looking down at the page. Sure enough, right there in the middle of the page, next to where he had been erasing, there was a face. Well, not quite a face. Just eyes and teeth.
What the fuck?
Chris looked back at the tree line. Every line had been exact. If he had drawn it, it had been there. Why hadn't he seen it before? That's when it hit him. There was something in the woods. He'd been staring at it and hadn't even noticed. And what's worse, it was between him and his tent.
All of a sudden, tri-tip sounds pretty good.
Chris said, standing up, notepad still in hand. He looked down the beach to where the two siblings were walking away.
Damn it!
He said to himself, grabbing his pack and following after them.
Paraidalia.
Alex said, looking intently at the sketch.
That's all it is. Your eyes and brain constantly look for faces and everything, like when you see pictures in textured ceilings.
I know what it is.
Chris said, a bit annoyed to be talked down to by someone at least 4 years his junior.
But I drew it perfectly. That face was there.
He said, taking the sketch pad back from her as they walked along the lake towards the other camp.
I think you're both high.
Paul slurred grumpily. He turned to Chris.
Hey, how about now?
Chris looked up at him.
Now what?
Chris asked. Paul pulled a beer from his pocket and held it directly in Chris's face.
Want a beer?
Chris looked at the gold-labeled Coors can inside.
I guess so.
As he reached for it, Paul grabbed his wrist with his empty hand and pulled him in close.
Chris.
Said Paul.
Paul.
Said Chris, mocking the big man's overly dramatic tone. Paul ignored it and continued.
Just 'cause I give you this beer doesn't mean you can fuck my sister, okay?
Whoa!
Alex said, pushing her way between the two.
Not that that was gonna happen, but who the hell are you to tell me who I can and can't sleep with?
To be fair, he was telling me I don't have his permission, which I respect.
Chris shook his captive arm slightly and Paul let go of it.
Yeah,
Said Paul.
you can sleep with him if you want, but not the other way around.
Chris and Alex looked up at him, and then at each other, and then back at Paul.
How long you think it'll take him?
Chris wondered aloud.
Not sure. He is really drunk.
A big smile spread across his big face.
Wait a sec, I mean...
The brute lowered his head and a strained look came over his face.
That's perfect logic, Polly.
Chris was suddenly wondering if he'd be better off with the thing in the woods when the smell of the meat reached his nose and voices from the camp became audible.
This is Chris.
Announced Alex as they approached the fire.
Chris, this is Trevor, Tina, and Jake. Welcome to our humble abode.
Hey, you're that dick from before, right?
Asked Jake, who Chris had already decided not to like.
Yep, that's me.
Chris said, taking a sip of the pocket warm to Coors.
That dick from before. Oddly enough, that was my nickname in high school.
He's cool,
said Paul, picking up a whiskey bottle from the table. He took a drink and wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his flannel coat. Chris walked around the fire and sat down on one of the logs circling the fire pit.
Chris is an artist.
Alex said, pulling the sketch pad out of Chris's hands.
Hey!
Chris exclaimed, as Alex handed it off to Tina.
That is creepy.
I know, right? And here's the real creepy thing. He didn't even know he drew it. Ooh.
She made a ghost sound and wiggled her fingers around at the audience at the campfire.
Can I have that back, please?
Chris pleaded. Alex took the book back from Tina and handed it back to him.
You're no fun,
She said with a bit of a pout. Trevor reached out to the fire with a barbecue fork and stabbed the meat roasting on the grill.
I think it's about done.
Chris looked at the charred hunk and his stomach growled. He could feel the can of tuna that was to have been his dinner digging into the small of his back. He let his bag slip off his shoulder and leaned it against the log. The tri-tip was heaved onto a flattened out empty cardboard beer box and roughly cut into thick chunks.
Come and get it!
Trevor called over his shoulder as he grabbed a large piece of meat off the table.
Ooh, ow, ow, hot.
He said as he juggled the piece back and forth between his hands to let the night air cool it. Chris, for the sake of his empty stomach, decided not to stand on ceremony. He pulled out his pocket knife and walked over to the table.
Thanks for having me, guys.
He said over his shoulder to the group before skewering a big square off the table.
So,
Chris said after swallowing a bite.
how long are you gonna be out here?
Tina spoke up between bites.
A few more days. We came out here this morning.
She said, gesturing to Trevor and herself.
They got out here last night.
I'm never leaving.
Announced Paul through a mouthful of gristle that was hanging out of his mouth into his bushy beard.
Don't you have jobs or school or something?
Everyone looked around at each other. Alex took over again and went around the circle.
Paul has just been fired from the gas station where he had the night shift for drinking on the job. Tina works at her mother's family's nail salon and has taken time off. Trevor is a musician and so apparently has no need of gainful employment. Jake was out of work and came down from Portland to commiserate with Paul for the aforementioned firing.
She made a show of taking a great breath.
And I
She finished with a bow.
am Daddy's little girl.
She put the back of her hand against her forehead in a woe is me gesture.
I needed some time to find myself.
She let her hand drop back to her side.
So I took a year off before I head to college.
Trevor spoke up.
So, what about you?
He nodded to Chris.
You an artist full-time?
Kind of. Well, not really.
He looked over across the lake at his fire.
I work for a design firm in LA and... What the hell?
He pointed and the rest of their eyes followed his finger.
My fire just went out.
So?
Tina said.
You left it like an hour ago, right? What did you think was going to happen?
No, I mean it went out. Like that.
Wait a minute.
Trevor said, trying to make sense of what he was seeing.
It's not out.
He was right. The fire wasn't out, but out of view. The trees behind it were still lit up, as if something had moved between the water and his fire on the other side of the lake.
Look at the water.
Jake said.
There's something there. A reflection.
He was a large, dark shape outlined by the fire's light on the rippling water.
What is that?
Asked Alex.
I don't know. But at least it's over there.
From over his shoulder, Chris heard a large intake of air, but before he could stop him, Paul's giant lungs were full and he bellowed.
Hey, fucker! What do y'all think you're doing?
There was a collective gasp as the reflection on the lake grew, as if it had stood up. It now seemed twice as big as before. It was still for a moment, stoic, casting its dark shadow across the surface of the water. Then quickly it moved off to the right, the same way Chris had followed Paul and Alex not an hour before. As the light from the fire reappeared, the creature's silhouette vanished into the darkness of the lake. The one thing that was apparent to all of them was that whatever it was, it moved very fast.
You better run!
Scoffed Paul, a bit of the schoolyard bully coming out in his words.
Paul, you big dope!
Alex cried, slapping him on the arm.
It's headed this way!
It's okay.
Paul said, staggering towards the tent.
I brought Bessie.
He leaned over and fell into the tent. The tent shook violently as the big man dug in his surroundings. A second later, the butt of a rifle protruded from the open flap.
Here's somebody.
He mumbled. Jake grabbed the rifle and offered his hand into the tent to help Paul sit up. Chris backed up as the barrel of the rifle swung wildly around in the air. Jake stood up straight and brought the rifle to his shoulder and aimed it down the path that led to their camp. Chris watched as he slid the bolt back and then pushed it up into place. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath as the click of the safety switch seemed to echo over the lake into the darkness. A loud thud and swish broke the silence as Paul fell back into the tent while trying to stand up.
Should we leave?
Asked Tina. The fear in her voice was apparent.
Nah, babe.
Said Trevor.
It was a bear or something.
he said, hugging her close. Alex huffed and pulled her coat around her.
Probably.
Said Jake, his face still pressed against the rifle.
I think if we just keep an eye out, we'll be fine.
After a few minutes of uneventful silence, everyone settled into their seats around the fire. Jake sat next to Chris with his back to the fire, the rifle propped up next to him. Tina and Trevor were cuddling together with a blanket wrapped around them. Alex was a foot or so to their left, staring at the fire, and Paul was wandering around with an axe they'd brought for chopping firewood. Chris looked at the three across from him and pulled out his sketch pad. He captured the moment, the look of contempt in Alex's face as she watched the couple out of the corner of her eye, the lines of Tina's short dark hair almost blending into Trevor's leather jacket, Trevor's hand reaching around Tina's head. He stopped drawing and stared at the picture. Trevor's hand was also around her waist.
Hey, guys.
He said, the concern in his voice apparent enough to get their attention. Tina screamed as she was yanked backwards over the log. Trevor reached out for her, but came up with the blanket instead. Tina managed to hold on to the other end as whatever it was dragged her away into the darkness. Jake grabbed the rifle and went running around the fire after her. Alex ran the 10 feet or so Trevor had been pulled and grabbed at the blanket. Suddenly the blanket went slack, sending Trevor and Alex backwards into the dirt. Chris couldn't move. He sat there while everyone ran down the beach after the screaming girl. A few seconds later, Paul arrived at the fire.
Where is everyone? What happened?
He asked breathlessly. Chris pointed off into the distance, not looking up from his sketch. The hand was now clearly not Trevor's, and that same face of eyes and teeth could be seen right over their heads. A gunshot rang out in the distance. Chris and Paul both looked up to see Alex come running back.
They got her back!
She yelled.
Get the first aid kit!
Chris ran for the tent, remembering the fiasco the last time Paul went in. He looked around for a moment before spotting a metal box with a red cross on the side. He grabbed it and ducked back out of the tent just in time to see Trevor and Jake carrying an unconscious Tina. She was covered in blood and had deep gouges on the side of her face and down her arms and legs. They laid her out on the blanket and Chris ran to them with the medkit and gave it to Alex.
Hang on.
Chris said as he ran to his pack. He dug down and grabbed his own first aid kit. His kit, unlike theirs, had 2 large bottles of superglue.
What are you gonna do with that?
Asked Trevor.
Liquid stitch.
Said Chris as he started to pinch one of the larger gashes back together.
They designed this stuff for triage in World War I and still use something very similar in ERs today.
He started beating the glue along the gash he had pinched together.
Faster than sewing her back up.
Regardless,
Said Jake, peering along the rifle into the darkness.
we need to get her to a hospital.
What was that?
Asked Chris.
I don't know. I never saw it.
Remarked Jake.
I just shot above where she was being dragged. I don't even know if I hit anything.
Look at this!
Said Alex, holding up a sketchbook.
You saw it, didn't you? You didn't say anything?
But I didn't. I looked back at the page, and it was there, and then
His voice trailed off as he applied another bead of superglue.
she was being dragged off.
Alex was hysterical.
Well, what the hell dragged her off then? What the hell is it?
Paul went to her and put his arm over her shoulders. Jake looked back from the sights of the rifle.
This sounds crazy, but I think it's invisible.
We all saw it from across the lake.
Said Trevor. Chris spoke up.
Don't you think we would have seen it then? That thing was huge, and all of us saw it way over there. Regardless, we have to go. Jake, take Trevor and the rifle and...
Bessie.
Paul corrected.
Fine. Take Bessie and go find some branches to make a stretcher. They need to be 6 to 8 feet long.
They can't leave us without a gun!
Alex panicked.
What if it comes back?
Here.
Said Jake, offering his belt knife to her. She shook her head violently. Jake shrugged and slipped it back into the sheath. Chris turned and took Alex by the shoulders.
Look, we have Paul, and Paul has an axe.
Well, no.
What do you mean, no?
I lost it.
How did you lose it?
I thought I saw something.
And?
I threw it
Where?
into the woods.
Where? In the woods.
I don't know. Remember, I said I lost it.
Unfucking believable.
Said Jake.
Okay, then.
Chris started again.
We'll put her on a sleeping bag, and we'll all carry her out.
Trevor ran into the tent and came back with a sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was unzipped and Tina was carefully laid in the middle.
Okay, Alex,
Chris said as they gathered around the makeshift stretcher.
you and I will take the front, and Paul, Trevor, you take the feet end. Jake, you hang behind and keep that rifle ready.
Chris found himself preparing for pushback. Maybe a, who the hell put you in charge? Or a, I think we should do blah blah blah. But everyone seemed to grasp the seriousness of the situation and moved to their places around the sleeping bag, took hold of the corners, and waited.
And lift.
Chris said, pulling up his corner. Aside from a slightly awkward delay on Paul's part, they had her off the ground and were moving up the trail towards the parking lot. Chris and Alex had flashlights, wrapped up in their ends like headlights, pointing along either side of the path, and another light was taped to the end of the rifle. They walked in silence for about 10 minutes. Everyone seemed to be watching the tree line on either side of the path. A loud crack from their left froze everyone in their tracks. Jake stepped slowly across the path towards the sound, the rifle pointed straight in front of him. The rest of the group was watching him intently as he crept off the path, the flashlight illuminating a small circle of forest before him. Tina screamed as the sleeping bag suddenly got heavier. It caught everyone off guard, and the weight ripped it from all but Paul's hands, sending the flashlights flying down the path. Jake spun around and the flashlight briefly showed Tina's flesh being torn open by unseen claws. He fired, the bullet going through something before embedding itself in Paul's leg. A scream erupted from where the shot was fired, a high-pitched primal scream that drowned out even Paul's bellowing. Paul let go of his corner and fell down, clutching his leg. The screaming lowered to a growl as the creature ran off into the woods, gaining opacity as it ran. Its body was dark, but as it ran through the beam of one of the flashlights that was lying on the ground, they could tell it was covered in short, thick fur that grew longer around the haunches. It turned sharply off the path, grabbing a thin trunk with an almost human-like hand to swing and pivot itself, as it vanished into the tree line. Jake kept the rifle aimed at where it had last been seen, while Chris took a look at Tina and Paul.
She's dead,
Chris said after checking her pulse.
and he's not going anywhere.
The bullet had lodged in Paul's leg just above the knee. Chris stood up and started to lift one end of the sleeping bag.
Let's get Tina off the sleeping bag. We're gonna need it.
What the fuck are you saying right now?
Said Trevor, stepping forward.
Don't even think that we are leaving her here for that thing.
Chris pointed to Paul, who was whimpering and clutching his leg.
It's almost pitch black on an unmaintained path. Do you really think he's gonna make it back down the hill on his own?
Jake spoke up.
Wait, we're going back to camp? What about getting the cars?
Tina was dying. We had to try, but now... If we try now, Paul could lose his leg.
Chris was looking around at the surrounding woods.
Plus, that thing could be back any minute.
Trevor crouched down and slid his arms under Tina's body.
Well, I'm not leaving her.
Fine.
Chris said and turned to Alex.
Can you shoot?
She nodded.
Jake, give the rifle to Alex and help me carry the oaf.
Hey, not cool. Can't you see I've been shot?
He smiled.
That's Mr. Oaf to you.
Alex took the rifle and Chris and Jake took their places as crutches behind her, and Trevor carried Tina behind them. It was slow going and took nearly twice as long to get back to the campsite. An hour later, they sat around the campfire, save for Paul, who had finished a bottle of whiskey and was snoring loudly in the tent. Trevor had laid Tina across the picnic table, like it was some strange funeral pyre.
So what's the plan?
Jake asked Chris. Suddenly all eyes were on him.
Tomorrow morning,
He started.
at first light, 2 of us head for the cars. We leave the rifle here, and once we get to the lot, take both cars and head in opposite directions until we A. Find cell service and call for help, or B. Find someone who can go get help.
He looked around the group.
Once we complete A or B, we turn around and we head back here. I know I'm going. Who else wants to volunteer?
Jake raised his hand.
I'll go.
No one else spoke up.
All right then.
Chris said.
We should try and rest now. We've only got a few hours before sunup.
Alex grabbed the rifle which was sitting next to her.
I'll keep watch then.
No,
Said Trevor, who had barely spoken up since they got back.
I will.
He stood up and walked over from the bench.
I don't think I could sleep anyway.
He held out his hands to her and she gave him the rifle.
Thank you, Trev.
Alex said quietly.
Wake me up when you need a break, and I'll take over.
Everyone but Trevor piled into the tent, and a few minutes later, fatigue had won and they were all asleep. Chris awoke feeling relatively good. Alex had cuddled up to him in the night, and it took almost a minute for his memory of last night and the horror of reality to wash back over him. He resisted the urge to bolt upright, and instead slowly raised himself on one elbow, and began carefully removing himself from the tangle of sleeping bags. He eventually made it to the door of the tent and unzipped it. A freezing blast of fresh mountain air hit him as he stepped out into the early morning. A stroke of fear ran down his spine as he looked around the campsite. The fire was out. Trevor was gone, and so was Tina's body. The morning had been coated in a thick blanket of fog, but he could just make out what looked like Trevor's leather jacket 100 yards or so away, just in front of the tree line. He walked carefully along the path towards it.
Trevor!
He whispered loudly, but got no reaction. Chris quickened his pace towards him.
Trevor!
He said a bit louder. Trevor turned around with a wild look on his face. Tina's body lay on the ground in front of him between two trees.
I'm gonna kill it.
Trevor hissed back.
It took her from me and I'm gonna kill the fucker.
As Chris watched, Trevor turned back to the forest and started pointing the rifle again. Then a rock behind Trevor rolled over with a loud clack, and he spun around just as the thing parted the fog in midair, landing on him and clutching his throat between its jaws. The gun went off as Trevor struggled to push it away. Chris saw the creature almost clearly now, as the condensation and blood clung to its body. The fur around its broad shoulders rippled as it tore at Trevor's arms and chest, ripping the leather sleeves to shreds. Blood sprayed in all directions as its teeth, which gleamed red with the ichor, worked their way through jugular veins and windpipe.
It's here! It's got Trevor!
Chris heard Alex's voice sound from somewhere behind him. Trevor had stopped struggling and was now being dragged into the forest by his neck, still caught in the jaws of the creature that then grabbed Tina's leg as it passed, and took her body too. Chris watched helplessly as the creature, the bodies, and the rifle all vanished into the woods.
Holy fuck, what are we gonna do?
Came Jake's voice from behind him.
I don't know. I guess we just make a run for it.
What?
Jake and Alex said in unison.
What choice do we have?
Chris asked.
If we stay, we'll just get picked off one by one.
He looked around.
If we go now, maybe someone will make it out.
His words sunk in, and Alex realized what he meant.
You don't think we have a chance, do you?
No. I don't.
He said.
We have to try.
What about Paul?
She asked. He ignored her question.
We each take a set of keys. That way no one gets to the lot without a way out.
I said, what about Paul?
I'm not going.
Said Paul from inside the tent.
I'll only slow you down. Plus, I have the worst fucking hangover.
Alex ran to him.
No, you have to come with us. I'm not leaving you.
Come on, sis.
He said, trying to sit up.
You gotta get out. That's it. I won't be the reason you die. It's already my fault you're here. Go. Now.
Alex started crying. Chris went to the tent and put his arm around her.
Alex, we have to go now.
She kissed her brother on the cheek and turned away with tears in her eyes.
Hey, Chris.
Paul said.
You remember what I said about you and my sister?
Yeah, surprised you do, though.
Well, you get her out of here alive, and you have my blessing.
Okay, Paul. I'll get her out alive.
Hey,
Said Jake.
what about me?
Fine. Chris, you can fuck Jake too.
The small chuckle broke the tension somewhat.
Alright, get out of here before it comes back.
Everyone got keys?
Chris asked. Jake patted his pocket, and Alex nodded.
Jake, we'll stay on either side of Alex. Hopefully that will give her some cover.
Jake nodded and squared himself towards the path.
We're going to quick march as long as we can.
He turned back towards the tent.
Paul, keep the tent flap closed and be as quiet as possible. We'll send someone back as soon as we can.
Thanks, I won't hold my breath.
Are we ready?
Chris asked. Alex and Jake nodded.
Let's move.
It took less than a minute for their legs to sync up as they found the rhythm, but by the time they topped the first hill, all of them were sucking air.
Okay. Maybe walk for a bit?
Panted Chris. Everyone agreed and they slowed down. The next leg of the path was level for the most part. They were able to catch their breath somewhat and quicken their pace again. Daylight seemed to make everything from the night before a little less real.
Keep your eyes peeled. That thing is still out there. Can't let her guard down.
Chris said. That seemed to spur the imaginations of all three, and before long they were almost running, as well as jumping at every noise or movement from the surrounding woods.
Wait,
Alex croaked as she stopped dead in her tracks. She started and then vomited in the middle of the path.
Oh, Jesus.
Jake said, turning away and gagging.
Fuck. Don't move.
Alex and Chris turned to where he was looking in spite of his warning. There, in the trees, just a few feet off the path, was a tree leaning shakily against the direction of the wind.
Back away slowly. Run when I tell you.
The three slowly backed away, trying not to step on each other. The tree sprang back upright as a roar ripped through the woods. The sound was so loud it left Chris's ears ringing. Alex tripped over a rock on the edge of the path and landed ass first in a bush. The creature started towards them, fast, bushes and tree limbs bending out of the way of their unseen attacker.
Run!
Jake shouted and drew his knife as he stepped towards it. Chris grabbed Alex's wrist and yanked her to her feet, almost dragging her down the path. Jake screamed directly in the creature's face as it pounced on him.
Don't look back!
Chris shouted at Alex as they sprinted towards the parking lot. They ran and ran. The sound of Jake screaming seemed to follow them for miles. Twice Alex tripped, but Chris had a firm grasp of her wrist, and he kept her on her feet. He held on so hard he thought it might break. They didn't stop running until they reached the parking lot, where they both collapsed against the hood of the first car.
Give me your phone.
He said, handing her his.
Get in and drive. Call me once you have signal and have gotten help.
She leaned in and kissed him.
I will.
She said and got into the second car. The engine started and kicked up dust as she turned around fast in the dirt lot. He walked as fast as his rubber legs would carry him to his truck, and watched her pull onto the dirt road that led to the highway. He smiled as he unlocked the door to his truck.
At least she made it.
He said as he saw the now familiar eyes and teeth over the shoulder of his reflection.